So we arrive at the point where we look at a couple of influential presidential elections. And, I mean, that's not to say the first two didn't matter, but the outcome was not in doubt. This is the first one where Washington is not a legitimate candidate, so we're not exactly certain who's going to be victorious. It ends up being a race between Vice President John Adams, Federalist, versus former Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Republican. Now you see the clear results and, in fact, the breakdown of how things go. By and large, southern states ended up going for Jefferson. Northeastern states went for Adams, and 3 electoral votes separate the two men. This is still a time when electors were allowed to cast 2 ballots. The only stipulations were they could cast 2 ballots, and they also had restrictions against casting ballots for men from their own states. So this means that the person who gets the most electoral votes is president, the runner-up is vice president. So this means that we have a president, John Adams, of one political party, and a vice president, Thomas Jefferson, of the other political party. Now, Adams did reach out to Jefferson because they had kind of drifted apart, obviously, politically, and Adams reached out to try and, rekindle that partnership, that friendship that they had through the Revolutionary years. And there are indications that Jefferson was going to accept, really put partisanship aside, prove that we could move forward as a nation. Apparently, he never sent his response because he was informed by James Madison that as party leader, he had a duty to his party first. So Adams and Jefferson didn't necessarily work well together, as we clearly saw within the last background, where Jefferson composed resolutions going against laws that his boss, John Adams, ended up signing. So that brings us to 4 years later, and Jefferson would refer to this as the Revolution of 1800. So ultimately, why is this the case? At this time, not only do we have different rules for electors, but each state was allowed to determine the time and method for selecting their electors. So in 1800, the election actually went from April to December. And this is also the last time in American history in which the sitting president had to run against his own vice president. Now, it proved to be exceptionally dirty, as Federalists claimed that Jefferson was a coward when he had served as Virginia governor during the Revolution. And they also brought up charges that he was an atheist and he had a child with one of his slaves. Adams is viewed as a monarchist who favored Britain. He was just too old and he was insane. So there's a lot of slinging that's going on by the supporters of each. New York voted first, and they had voted for Adams in 1796. However, a guy named Aaron Burr had built up enough political alliances to get the 12 electors to switch their votes to Republican electors. Now, he was rewarded with a selection to run, quote-unquote, as vice president. Now, Alexander Hamilton also actively worked behind the scenes to attempt to dissuade Federalists from voting for Adams, and he even wrote a pamphlet that defamed his character. In the end, Adams received 65 electoral votes compared to 73 for Jefferson. But Burr also received 73 because, remember, electors cast a total of 2 votes with no indication of who they wanted to be president versus vice president. Now, historians actually point to the overrepresentation of southern states due to the 3/5 compromise and the ensuing electoral votes they received as a deciding factor. And Adams would actually have been re-elected without those extra votes that the southern states got. Publicly, Burr indicated that Jefferson should be the next president of the United States. But privately, he refused to step aside, as the vote now legally goes to the House of Representatives. And he even actively campaigned for himself. 9 of the 16 states were needed to officially decide the race. 8 of them are controlled by Republicans, and 2 of them are split. So Federalists could block whomever they didn't want to become president. Hamilton helped influence the vote as Federalists did control the House, even though he's not in the government, and he stated that, in the choice of evils, let them take the least, them being Federalists in Congress. Jefferson is, in my view, less dangerous than Burr. For his role, Adams said nothing. He believed this was a matter for the legislature to resolve, not the executive branch, so he kind of sat it out. In a 1-week time span, the House voted 34 times, and each time, neither Jefferson nor Burr gained a majority, and it was an 8-6 vote each time. The House was absolutely desperate to end the impasse, and James Bayard of Delaware actually abstained from that 35th vote. Now, he's the only representative from Delaware, so by abstaining or not voting, it meant that Jefferson only needed 8 states instead of 9, because only 15 would be casting ballots. Now, in the end, 10 ended up voting for Jefferson, and Burr became vice president. Allegedly, in a deal that was made behind the scenes, Jefferson promised not to do anything with Hamilton's financial program, and he also promised to keep the Navy intact and keep Federalist appointees in office. This was all said to be Hamilton's doing, surprise, as he instructed Bayard to push for these terms. So, with that, Adams is going to leave town the morning of the inauguration because he wanted to get to Baltimore in one day on his way back home. And apparently he had to take the early stagecoach at 4 in the morning. Now, Jefferson calls this a revolution because he believed it signaled a shift towards a nation that would now be based on what were called Republican principles, Republican lowercase r. Now, voting rights are also going to increase. The majority of states that allowed for the direct election of electors voted for Jefferson, and the ones where the state legislatures picked the electors ended up mainly going for Adams. Now, the problem of the tie that we had was also resolved by the 12th Amendment. Moving forward, each elector was instructed to cast 1 ballot for president and 1 for vice president, and they had distinguished between the two so that they would decrease the odds that this happened again. So the Federalists are out, Republicans are in, and the nation moves in a new direction.